Welcome to session 2 of Progress Monitoring, where we're going to talk about data tracking. And at first, I want to talk about being data rich and yet information poor. When I think about this quote, this idea, I think about all the data we actually have on the students that we work with, right? I think of screeners, I think of benchmarks, I think of homework, I think of assessments, I think of formative assessments, summative assessments. I have all of this information, anecdotal information, survey information, all of this data on students. Yet, sometimes I don't feel like we have the just right information we need in order to make decisions. Even with all of this data we have collected, we sometimes struggle to answer this question, is what we are doing working? So in this course, we're going to talk both about functional tracking and academic tracking as two different types or systems of data tracking. But I want to talk this week about functional skills, because functional skills were always the things that were more difficult for me to collect data on because of a couple different things. They don't always align to standards or skills or tests or curriculums. And sometimes the nuance of it is so different from student to student that knowing what and how to collect was challenging and is very difficult. So this week we're going to talk about three things. We're going to understand the process of creating and crafting simple and effective data sheets. We're going to identify common ways to measure behavior, and then we're going to practice with different real examples. So we are going to go through this sequence piece by piece and kind of understand what each of these pieces looks like when it comes to collecting different data. So first, we're going to talk about prioritizing behaviors. So when we talk about functional skill data collection and data collection related to behaviors, these are things outside of our normal academic data collection. We want to be able to prioritize the behaviors that we want to collect data on, and we want to make sure that those are the behaviors that are at the beginning of a chain, because we want to recognize the initial part of a chain of behaviors in a sequence, so that we know when to best interact and engage in that chain. Then we want to write behavior definitions. This is a simple, obvious sounding thing that often gets left out of the process, but we want to write behavior definitions so that all stakeholders who are responsible for collecting data knows what that behavior looks like and what it doesn't look like. I can tell you from personal experience, I had a hard time getting different stakeholders to collect data when I wasn't involved in the space. And as soon as I introduced definitions, that data collection piece with stakeholders became so much more simplified because we were both speaking the same language. Here's an example. Elopement might be the thing that we would be measuring. That's the behavior. We defined it here as leaving the room without permission. And then we provided some examples and non-examples. So there's no argument, there's no gray, because we're trying to fill in that nuance. So examples of elopement might be for the student running from the classroom, or walking out of the cafeteria, or leaving the building without permission. Non-examples, though, things we would not count as elopement, would be getting out of their seat without permission, but staying in the classroom, or leaving the room with permission. Neither of those things would count as elopement. But when I asked people to collect data, anecdotally they would say, oh yeah, they were eloping, but they were just getting out of their seat without leaving the classroom. And that differed than the data collection I was trying to collect. So now that we're speaking the same language, it becomes a whole lot easier to involve other stakeholders. Clarifying our question is also very important. So a good data sheet answers a good question. So we have to decide what type of question we want data on. So how many of something, how often of something, how long of something. Step 4 then is actually creating the data sheet itself. And we're going to go over some examples of this to keep it simple. If we want other stakeholders to get involved in collecting our data with us and talking about the data and using the data, we have to create a data sheet that is accessible and simple and straightforward. then practice, 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 and train other people who are going to use them, right? Just like students need practice to master new skills, adults also need practice with those things. So if we can do those things, we're well on the path to get there. But it's not as simple as just creating these data sheets. We have to know what type of data we want to collect. So up on the screen there, you'll see frequency, rate, duration, latency, intensity, interval recording, time sampling, all different methods or different types of data that we can collect on students when it comes to functional skills and behavior. But with each of these, there's a time and a place and a how to collect those information. So that's what we're going to go over this week. And then at the end, I'm going to have you try out some data collection, depending on what type of behavior data you want to collect. So the first way we're going to talk about is frequency. You would do this if you're trying to answer how many times did this student do this, okay? This is very effective for short, discrete behaviors, and so oftentimes you'll see this used for aggression or self-injury or threats, but you wouldn't use this for off-task behavior or behaviors that last varying lengths. Caveat, you might be tracking different episodes, but for the most part, this is true, right? Let me show you an example of what a data sheet for this might look like. So here's the front of a sheet that we might keep with a student in order to track. It has their schedule on the left-hand side, and then you have those frequency of behaviors that we're looking for. So this is just how many times has this happened. So we have physical aggression there, verbal threats, negative self-talk, and then a back side of the sheet, we define those behaviors. So whoever is collecting the data knows what that behavior looks like, especially with some of these examples, right? Physical aggression, well, I know that person A may think that that means this. Person B may think that that means this. We need some way to ensure that whoever is collecting the data is collecting the same type of data, so we have accurate, valid, and appropriate data. Eventually, as we go through these different data collections, you know that we'll be able to graph and visualize this information in a way that will easier show stakeholders such as parents or other staff members or even the students themselves if the thing that they're working on is worth the effort. Way number 2 is duration. So we use duration as a data collection tool if we wanted to answer the question, how long was student blank? So this is really effective for longer behaviors that have an obvious onset and offset. So if you have behaviors such as elopement, how long were they gone from this space, right? Or prolonged aggression, how long were they in crisis? Or tantrums, or restraints and seclusions. These are all things where duration would be the type of information that we'd want to collect. You wouldn't use this most of the time for off-task behavior or any behavior that really lasts longer than a minute. So this is for not those types of information. This is an example of a duration log. So you might see that it has the instructions and the behavior that we define, and then we have a start and a stop time and a date and then that length. You can see how many minutes generally are used in a duration log. It's more than those minimal off task. Way number 3 that we could collect data is latency. It's how long before they blank. So this measures the time from the antecedent to a behavior. Oftentimes you'll use this for time to start a task, so task-related stuff, or time elapsed before following a direction, right? What you wouldn't use this for is how long a behavior lasts. You'd use duration for that, or for behaviors that usually start within like a minute. Here's an example of that type of log. We have a latency log here as well. Our 4th one would be rate. This would answer the question, what percentage of the time did so-and-so blank? So this is really effective when the behavior can only happen under certain conditions, and often it's used for compliance, coping skills, academics. Usually we present this as a percentage, but in order to get a percentage, you do need a numerator and a denominator. is used when you're trying to get sentences such as, Jack is using his coping skill on this percentage of opportunities, or Jill complied with this percentage of directions within 5 seconds. This is an accurate rate log, so it doesn't have to be difficult. That's the thing with developing data sheets. If you define the behaviors and you make them really simple, stakeholders are much more likely to successfully navigate and consistently fill those sheets out. So this one is as simple as the date, the number of times they were frustrated, and the number of times they used coping skills. We put those into a fraction, numerator, denominator, we came up with a percentage. Very simple, quick, effective way to collect data on the thing that we're working on. Way number 5 is intensity. Do not see this as frequently, but this measures how intense any given behavior was. So really effective when behaviors can vary greatly in intensity or severity. Sometimes most often you'll use this for dangerous behaviors, or behaviors that need different levels of support, but you wouldn't use this for low-level behaviors. If they're all kind of near the same margin of concern, you wouldn't use this. Caveat, if you do create a scale of intensity, you want to keep it to no more than 4 or 5 levels. Here's an example of one of those scales when it has to do with regulation turning into physical aggression. You have a scale with the definitions for what those look like on each part of the scale. Way number 6 is interval recording. This would answer the question, how often was this student blank? We see this most frequently as a point sheet. You would use this when frequent challenging behavior throughout the day or session, when you're trying to pinpoint those things. You use this when you don't really need to know the exact frequency. You'd use this if you have a team willing to collaborate with you. You'd need this to know when a ballpark, how often a behavior occurs, when you need to remind the adults to coach positive behaviors. But when you wouldn't use a point sheet is when you're trying to figure out the function of a behavior, or you need to understand the full behavior chain, right? This happens and this happens and this happens. Not appropriate to use interval recording in that situations. You also wouldn't use a point sheet when behavior happens frequently within a given period, or if it only happens once a day, or if it's incredibly dangerous or extreme or intense. Here's an example of what one of those interval data sheets would look like. So you have your intervals of time on the left side, and then you have a tally or point system. So Y is for verbal aggression, follow directions. You have goals on top, and then what those will look like underneath. And then we have way number 7, which is time sampling, about how often was this student blank. So this is really effective when it's difficult or impractical to figure out exactly when a behavior starts and stops. It estimates a percentage of the time. So often you'll use this for academic engagement or on tasks or out of seat, but we would avoid using this for any type of discrete or quick behavior such as aggression. So here's an example of what momentary time sampling looks like. You see there's just consistent intervals that you would collect data on this student at any given time. So here's what our homework is going to be. You're going to watch a video that I have attached, and you're going to run through this process yourself. This is a little bit messy because data collection is messy. Remember, we want to keep it very simple. So we're going to walk through this step. First, you're going to walk through, you're going to see what type of behavior do I think I want to prioritize collecting. What is most appropriate if we were going to work on something, right? Then I want you to write a definition for the behavior that you're going to collect data on, okay? So if it's failure for following directions, do that. If it's property destruction, do that. If it's interrupting or oversharing or inappropriate comments or name calling or whatever it is, I want you to write the definition for what that actual behavior is. Then I want you to clarify your question. So what are we collecting data on? And you're going to create a very simple data sheet. So first part of your data sheet will be how you collect your data, and the second part of your data sheet will be the definitions for the behavior that you're trying to collect. Then you're going to collect the data. What you come up with, I'm also going to collect the data to see if we're calibrated, to see if your data sheet is appropriate for any stakeholders that would pick it up and use it. Now, we know that functional data collection is only a small portion of the data that you are asked to collect in the settings and the students that you work with. We know that academic skills are also a very large chunk of the data that you're collecting on students. So in our next session, we're going to go over different types of simple data sheets that we can use when collecting academic skills. And after that, we're going to talk about graphing and visually sharing that information with other stakeholders.